if you have to give forgiveness or ask for forgiveness at whatever age, take care of that now, because you don't know if you're going to be able to do that tomorrow.
Today's topic is one that is often considered taboo, yet it is one of the few universal life experiences, and that is death. This episode will shed a figurative light on things we all need to be aware of as we prepare ourselves and our loved ones for that final journey.
Hi folks, I'm your host Edythe Richards, and you may know me from my podcast series, Myers-Briggs Question Corner, or my website, atopcareer.com. I've spent the last 20 years of my career helping people get smart about their careers. And I've found that lots of smart people aren't successful. Why is that? I'm convinced it's due to emotional intelligence. In EQ at Work, I'm bringing you inspiring people and messages to help you get smart about your emotions. Any close encounter with death reminds us of the fragility of life, a fact my guest today knows all too well. Ilene Thorman had a near-death experience herself. For many people who have had NDEs or near-death experiences, the event fades and life eventually returns to normal. Some people, like Ilene, use the experience to reorder their priorities. In Ilene's case, her experience with death was one factor in becoming an advocate for hospice care, which is focused on providing comfort and dignity, emotional support, as well as resources and advice for caregivers. Ilene, welcome to EQ at Work. It's really a pleasure to have you here today to talk about what is a very difficult topic for many of us.
Right. Thank you for having me, Edythe.
So you've been working in the healthcare field for a number of years, particularly in hospice, and I know that's your passion. And your near-death experience was one factor that helped you to define that passion. So I'd love to just dive right in to hear about this experience.
So about 23 years ago, I became very ill and I was put into a medically induced coma for 5 weeks. They did not anticipate me to survive. I'm also a type 1 diabetic, which complicated the treatment. And what I had was septic shock. So the doctor's goal was to get the bacteria out of my system. And in this coma for 5 weeks, I lost a lot of weight. I did survive, obviously. And when I came out, I had to go through a lot of therapy. Cognitive therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy. I could not walk. I couldn't talk. It was very strange to wake up out of a coma and not being able to do the things that you take for granted.
I can't imagine what that experience must have been like. Cognitively, where were you at that time? What was it like?
So I remember being in a fog. I remember just kind of being out of it. I didn't really know the extent of it until I was transferred to inpatient therapy. I was a neuropsychologist. I worked with him for many months, and they would show me a card with, say, a bird on it, and they would ask me, what is on this card? I didn't know. At the time, I didn't realize that I should have known that, and I didn't know it. So that was the initial assessment, that part of it that they gave me, and to determine what therapy I needed. At the time, I didn't really think about it. I just did what I had to do. You know, the physical therapy, all the mini exercises. I have 2 3-inch binders of my exercises that I had to do cognitively.
Oh.
Sometimes I go through those again because our brains can retrain themselves. I guess it's the nerves or I'm not medically knowledgeable in that per se, but it just retrained itself to do things so I could function like everybody else.
And this was 20 years ago. Obviously, you've, quote unquote, recovered from that and your life's moved on.
Yeah, I've been able to work around any challenges I may have. It's been so long now that I don't see any of the challenges. I think I've developed coping skills or strategies to work around it. I think everybody has the moments where they're looking for a word and they can't come up with it. So I don't feel too out of the normal when things like that happen. I just work with it.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I want to just backtrack just a minute here because I think when people are hearing a near-death experience or having been in a coma, even a medically induced coma for a certain amount of time, we naturally want to ask, as I did, well, what do you remember about the near-death experience?
So I don't have any recall of anything during my coma. I didn't see anything. I do remember at the very end when they were weaning me off of the medication to come to. I remember being extremely thirsty. I was riding in the back of a pickup truck to an orange juice factory. I was guzzling all this orange juice. The people who were driving, which I didn't recognize, left, and I got out of the truck. There were all these boxes on the beach. I was in Florida at the time, propped up by a stick. So I went in a box. The guy closed the box and then opened it. And I remember, we've been for you. So I'm not quite sure what all that means, but I remember it like it was yesterday.
That's what I was going to say. I'm like, wow, that's a really vivid, I guess it was a dream, right?
Yeah, I guess. I'm not really sure what it was.
It's funny that you can remember that in such detail all these years later, right?
Yeah, yeah, it is.
Well, I'm really pleased to hear that, you came out of that so well and you're pretty much back to your normal self. But that experience, it sounds like was a catalyst or a defining moment for some of the work that you're doing now.
Yes, I would agree with that because having a near-death experience, and there's all kinds of experiences, but in my case, one day I was fine. The next day I'm in the ambulance going to the emergency room, and then I'm in ICU for 5 weeks. I was in the hospital for 3 months total from beginning to end. So you can't count on tomorrow. And I've learned to appreciate each day, to appreciate people for who they are, meeting them where they're at instead of expecting them to do what I want or see things how I want. All kinds of different outlooks that's changed in my life. I think I've always been that way, but knowing that you're not promised tomorrow is to have a little more patience, to be more thoughtful, empathetic, to understand what people go through medically at different times in their life.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's helped you to be more empathetic.
Yeah, more empathetic, having an understanding. I would agree with that. I gained most of my death experience when I got my first job in hospice, which I feel that my near-death experience has led me towards hospice work, and I believe God had a purpose for me to help others in this area.
So how long have you been working in hospice care?
A little over 5 years. I started out as a hospice volunteer coordinator. Currently, I'm a health information manager with a hospice provider. And I've just always had, since then, a passion for the elderly, trying to give them distractions or visiting them. Or currently, I'm making over 100 Valentine Day cards to give to the senior citizen at facilities for Valentine's Day.
That's excellent. And it's so refreshing to hear this because it's such needed work. It's just a field that we don't hear about a lot of people going into. And it's so needed because it's something we're all going to face someday. And it's something we're most likely going to have to face with our loved ones. And it can be overwhelming, I imagine, especially for the patient themselves, but also for the caregivers.
Yes, that's something I noticed once I got into working in hospice. A lot of times there's a level of dysfunction that occurs within a family because they're afraid, they're scared, they don't understand the death process. And to be frank, we're all going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And my passion has become to educate people on how to plan their last journey because it's going to happen. And it can be the greatest gift you can give to your loved one to have everything planned out and things in place. So it can become a beautiful experience when your loved one passes. And I experienced that personally with my dad.
Oh, okay. Are you able to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So when I first got my job with hospice, I was very close to my dad. We're like two peas in a pod.
Huh.
I was living in Virginia. He lived in Iowa. I get this job, and for 3 years, I'm telling him everything I'm learning about hospice because I knew nothing about hospice. So 3 years later, it was his last journey. He was given a choice in addition to his dialysis 3 times a week. He also was going to have to go in twice a week to get his lungs tapped. And my dad interrupted the doctor, which is not like my dad. He was a very kind man. He would never interrupt anybody. And he just cut the doctor off and said, "No, I want to go on hospice." And that's kind of when my light bulb went on why I got my hospice volunteer job 3 years ago. I was educating my dad, not knowing I was doing that. So when it came to his time, he wasn't afraid. He didn't hear all the false myths that people say about hospice. And his passing was really a beautiful experience for him as well as our family.
Wow, what a gift you were able to give him. And it's just interesting what you say that at the time you really didn't even realize what you were doing or that it was a gift. But now looking back, it surely was.
Yeah, and I think that's where I've gotten my passion to start educating people. My hope is to someday give presentations to groups, whether it be at a church or a civic group or employer, developing a blog with resources because there's wills, end of life information, advance directives. What do you want to wear in your casket? I remember when my mom passed away, she passed away a lot sooner, much too early. And it was very traumatic trying to decide, well, what is mom going to wear? What kind of casket does she want? What music would she want? Does she want a memorial service or not? So it was very traumatic. I've experienced both sides of being prepared and not being prepared on what to do for someone's last journey.
I can't even imagine here. I mean, there's so much that you have to think about that you don't think about until often it's too late. Like so many of I wouldn't think about what someone would want to wear in a casket or the type of casket, how they'd like the funeral to be, any of those things. And then not to mention all of the logistical, financial things that you have to be aware of.
Yeah, they're the logistical things you don't think about until you need to think about them. I just had a friend share with me whether to put the glasses on her mom in the casket, and it's all about honoring and respecting the loved one who has died. I think most people would think that way. So it's really helpful and beneficial for the family member to know these things before they have to decide.
Right. Yes, how they'd like to be honored. And then I think another thing that can overwhelm the caregivers a lot that I'm not sure if you can speak to this either, but having all of their documents and their necessary paperwork in one place, or, you often hear about people kind of scrambling there at the end. They don't know where the bank account information is or the will, things like this that can really overwhelm the next of kin.
Yeah, it opens up a whole nother can of worms. For instance, if a son or daughter has power of attorney for their loved one, well, they find out after the fact, once their loved one dies, they no longer have the power of attorney. And for them to get to their mom or dad's or grandparents' bank account to pay for the funeral, they no longer have that ability just with the power of attorney. And I do want to give a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. I'm not an accountant. I just know this from what I've heard from other people of what they've learned.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. I probably would not have even known to ask that question. But this is the type of work that you're doing. You're just somebody who I think provides, on the one hand, the emotional support there, both for the family and for the patient, but then also knows the right questions to ask here at the end. Would that be accurate?
Yes, and my mission is I want to provide the resources, give them links or encourage them to find a lawyer, the subject matter experts, to have everything in place. And I believe people as early in their 20s should be putting together this plan because we are not promised tomorrow. And God forbid, something happens too soon. What are your loved ones going to do? And especially when they're young, it's very traumatic. I know that from personal experience, but that's a whole nother story to know what needs to be done in order to honor the loved one.
You're right, because we never know what's going to happen. So one of the best things we can do is just to be as prepared as possible. And I'm thinking about small daily chores around the house, like picking up the mail or writing down phone messages or laundry, feeding pets, taking care of children, picking up children from soccer practice or whatever. And how overwhelming that can be for caregivers who, they have to do these things for themselves and for their own families, but then also for the patient, for their loved one. And it can't be easy. So being able to have someone to provide those resources for and having someone as an advocate, what a special gift that could be.
And you said the right word, an advocate for the loved one. The caregivers is very stressful. By educating caregivers, people, when that time comes, it's not going to be as scary. And hospice is a great tool to help families understand the dying process. As a child caring for your parent, all of a sudden you see changes in how they act, how they look, not understanding the process. And hospice helps educate the caregivers on what's going on, what to expect, the signs of when somebody is preparing to pass. That's a whole nother show there. So just being familiar with that and having a resource through the hospice nurse can be very helpful in minimizing the anxiety.
Yeah, no kidding. And again, it's things that we don't think about until often it's too late. So I really appreciate you being here and talking about this so we can educate our listeners on this. I want to switch gears just a little bit here for a second and talk about a related topic. We often hear that people have regrets as they get closer to death. And I've wondered if you've experienced this with any of the people you've worked with. Forgiveness is often a huge theme for people. There may be regret about having been unkind or selfish throughout one's life. I myself, I have to admit that I've been so fortunate so far to not have experienced many deaths of family or friends. But I imagine it not only makes you think about your own mortality, but you acknowledge at the same time that life really does go on. What would you say to that?
I've seen that a lot as well, where the person who's on their last journey wish they would have said something or asked forgiveness or given forgiveness to a family member. Their journey with God or their higher being, if they have regrets for things not done that they wanted, that's a big part of the last journey. And I encourage everybody every day to be mindful. If you have to give forgiveness or ask for forgiveness at whatever age, take care of that now, because you don't know if you're going to be able to do that tomorrow.
Oh my gosh, that was so pivotal right there. Well said, Ilene. What would you say to families, just being mindful about life and about the people you interact with every day? What else would you say to people about approaching end of life that they might not know?
I would want to say and to highly encourage people to start now. Whatever age you are, start now. Some of the easier things to do are making a will, writing down your passwords and your logins to your financials that your loved one are going to need to have access to. Also, to have those conversations with your loved one. Select who's going to be the primary person to oversee the last day of your journey. And do that now. There's no reason to wait. There's quite a few websites out there, which on my blog will have resources on how to have the conversation. Having a little book that you can fill in all of this information, and sometimes even family history that maybe the grandkids or great-grandkids may not know that Aunt Sally and Uncle John, their relations to whoever, or the genealogy part of it. If you have that information, put it in there for future generations to know.
Oh, that's such good advice there. What would you say to people who are on the other side of the spectrum and, they are approaching end of life and they might not be ready to have these conversations or haven't thought about any of these topics yet?
I would really encourage them to start talking about it, putting things in place, because as I said earlier, it is the greatest gift you can give a loved one by having these things in place. Pre-planning your funeral or having life insurance available to help with those expenses. Although a little insider here, insurance you don't get right away. So you need to have resources to pay the funeral home before they'll conduct the funeral. So just having those resources.
Yeah, I understand. And I'm not even sure about the cost of this, but I'm sure it's pretty expensive. And a lot of people might not realize the expense associated with these things.
The average funeral burial is $9,000. Cremation is like $4,000 to $5,000. But it does depend on geographically where you're located. So that's something else you want to research to know ahead of time. Well, how much do I need to leave for my loved ones to take care of me? And even if you want to have a party, maybe you want to have fireworks and I don't know, a movie or, it's what you want. There's no limit to how you want to leave this earth.
I didn't even think about that. Fireworks. Wow. But as you said, it's really about having these conversations with your loved one so that you know them and you know how they want to be honored. And it's never too soon to start talking about this.
Exactly.
Ilene, do you have any other bits of information that you'd like to share that you think would be helpful to people who don't know much about this topic?
I think I shared a good starting point. I leave everyone with start now with the conversation and check into hospice because they can be a great resource. And I do have a blog that will have a bunch of resources, how to start the conversation or grief and mourning. That's a whole nother piece of hospice. That would be endlifeawareness.com.
That's excellent. And we're going to include that website in our listening notes. So thank you very much for that, Ilene. And thank you so much for being here today to talk about a potentially very difficult topic. Really appreciate your insight.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Many people can't fathom the appeal of a career working in hospice. The reality is that it's very challenging to deal with death and terminal illness on a daily basis. And if you've ever spoken with someone who works in hospice, they rarely describe it as exhausting or depressing. Like Ilene, they speak of this work in positive terms. It's an honor to be with someone as they transition. It's extremely gratifying. It's what I was meant to do. It's sacred work. In speaking with Ilene, one thing I was struck by was her ability to focus not on her own agenda, but to instead focus on the end-of-life wishes of the patients and families she cares for. We hear about social responsibility in the corporate sense, which is often known as CSR, meaning corporate social responsibility. And it means that a company takes steps to ensure there are positive social and environmental effects associated with the way the business operates. But social responsibility is also an element of emotional intelligence. In EQ terms, social responsibility is your ability and tendency to consider the needs of the group. It's the moral compass that directs your behavior towards promoting the greater good of others. And it's not just about writing a check, but rather wanting to help others and having a positive impact on our group and our community. If you are one of those people like Eileen who naturally thrives when you help others, your social activity will most likely bring you a deep sense of fulfillment and inner self-worth. Many people who are skilled in this area are active and avid volunteers, and it's well known that volunteering is more than just a noble pastime. Science has demonstrated the positive effects of doing good for others time and again. Volunteering and acts of altruism are known to have health benefits, such as decreased blood pressure and pain, increased endorphins, and other feel-good chemicals in the brain. It helps increase life expectancy, as well as overall happiness and well-being. Ultimately, helping others boosts our own self-worth. But not everyone is as selfless as Eileen. If you tend to focus more on projects that are of interest to you personally, instead of what's best for your work group, your social group, your family, or your community, here are some ways that you can start being more socially responsible. Think about aligning your interests with those of the larger group. For example, if you love basketball, think about donating your time to teach others. Being a good corporate citizen doesn't always need to involve a financial investment. You can donate things you no longer use, or you can even just make a point of saying good morning and asking someone how their weekend was. If you're a leader, you can also show others that you're willing to roll up your sleeves in support of your team or your colleagues. Leading by example sounds easy, but the most successful leaders are the ones who practice what they preach. My favorite way of helping others is just to be there. When someone I know is in need, I'll give them a call, send them an email to check in on them, and ask them if they'd like to talk. Anytime someone asks for my help, I reach out immediately, or as immediately as I can, instead of letting it go and calling back at my convenience. And I listen intently, focusing on their experience. There really is nothing more satisfying than the feeling of doing good for others. The ability to develop meaningful connections with others can be hugely impactful in combating stress through camaraderie and increasing trust and overall well-being. And let's face it, we could use more altruism today. Try it yourself and put EQ to work.
Thanks for listening to EQ at Work. Find us using the hashtag EQ at Work, or visit our website eqatwork.net. Subscribe to this podcast via iTunes, Spreaker, or your favourite podcast platform. We'd love you to leave a rating or review, and if you have a moment, a simple share would be wonderful. Remember, tell your friends. Mastering your emotions matters. Next week's episode is our final one this season, and if you are a teacher, you'll want to be sure to tune in. Our guest is Cindy Zakis, a former teacher who used her experience in the classroom to launch 2 other careers. But it's the skills that teaching taught her that have allowed her to succeed outside of the classroom. Even if you're not a teacher, Cindy has many lessons you'll be able to use.